So I'm going to ask the offshore wind panel folks to please come up. We at WIRES are a very collegial group, and we've got a really cozy arrangement for you up here on the stage. I will caution you, given where they're at, don't push the chair back too far on any of these. It's a little tight. But as we get started, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the moderator for our panel, and then he in turn will go ahead and introduce each of the panelists. Our moderator for the offshore wind panel today is Sam Mintz. Sam is the New England correspondent for RTO Insider. He is based in Boston. He covers energy and climate policy in New England with a focus on ISO New England, NEPOOL, and state legislatures. He's had an extensive amount of experience working for a variety of publications, including Politico, E&E News, the Boston Business Journal, and the Cape Cod Times. So, Sam, welcome, and thank you for moderating this panel. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce our panelists, and we're looking forward to a really lively and interesting discussion. So thank you all very much for being here.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Can you guys hear me? There we go. Yeah, so I'll introduce these guys in a second. I just wanted to note, to set this up real quickly, that I was reading last night through the early draft of the Schumer-Manchin climate agreement, which I'm sure many of you have been looking at, and I came across a provision for $100 million to spend on analysis, study, convening, looking at transmission for offshore wind specifically. So a lot of what we'll be talking about is how should we spend that money? What do we need to learn? What do we need to work on here? So yeah, we have to my right, George Sassine with NYSERDA, is the Vice President of Large Scale Renewables. He'll be giving us the New York perspective. Lathrop Craig, Vice President at PSEG, will give us the New Jersey and PJM perspective. And then Bill Quinlan from up here in New England, Eversource President of Transmission and Offshore Wind. So yeah, let's start with George, and each panelist will talk for a few minutes, then I'll have some questions and we can take questions from the audience.
Thanks, Sam. Good morning, everybody. I just want to say, Gordon, what a wonderful talk. It's really fascinating and also validates a lot of things that we're thinking about in New York, so thank you for that. So my name is George Sassine. I recently joined NYSERDA about 10 months ago. I used to work at GE for about a decade, and I'm in charge of any project above 10 megawatts in the state of New York. So that includes onshore wind, solar, bulk energy storage, transmission projects, the couple tier 4 projects. One is basically importing hydropower from Canada all the way to New York City. Another one is the project building a bunch of wind and solar in upstate New York and building a transmission line down to New York City as well. And I also cover the offshore wind program in New York. What I really want to talk about today is just give a little bit of context of offshore wind, where we are in New York, and how transmission, building the transmission grid for offshore wind, and what things are looking like today. Number one, New York has the largest offshore wind market in New York. What's really driving a lot of our clean energy work is what we call the New York Climate Act, and it mandates basically to get us to 70% renewables by 2030 and a zero emission grid by 2040. And what's really unique about the Climate Act is it's a law. It's not a policy. We are mandated by law to achieve these goals. And part of these goals is getting to 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035, and that is the floor. A lot of the studies are suggesting that we might need up to 20 gigawatts of offshore wind to decarbonize the New York grid. And where we are today is we have about 5 projects that are being developed at 4.3 gigawatts, so we're almost halfway to reaching our goals. And I'm really excited to share. I don't know if you've seen that, but 24 hours ago, we announced the 3rd offshore wind solicitation in New York that's been released. My team has been working around the clock to get this out, and it's really exciting, and we're committed to award in this solicitation a minimum of 2 gigawatts. It could go all the way to 4.6 gigawatts and help us fill the full 9 gigawatt pipeline. But at the bare minimum, we're looking for 2 gigs for this round. As part of this third offshore wind solicitation, there's a few things around transmission that we've included. Number one, we are prioritizing HVDC. And number two, we are requiring building a meshed-ready grid. And the idea there is, eventually, we want to create the optionality to eventually build a meshed-ready grid and connect all these different offshore grid projects to each other if our planning leads us to that conclusion that this is a good thing to do. So, we've done a lot of studies with the support of Brattle and Siemens and Hatch that suggest that building a meshed-ready grid for offshore would save us up to $60 million annually. And given that we're still doing our planning and we're still studying our different options, our approach has been not to let the planning process prevent us from making progress. So we're continuing with our planning process, and as we move forward, we're being very pragmatic and keeping our options open. So with that, I also want to mention on the planning side, something we're doing in parallel to the offshore wind solicitation is we're studying our cable routes options. So where New York is undergoing a cable routing assessment as we speak. What this looks, I'm happy to talk about it in greater detail later, but what this basically does is provide us more information to provide to figure out what are the optimal routes to connect these offshore wind projects into New York City. And with that, hopefully that provides you a good overview of where we are and where we're going and what comes next for New York.
Great, thanks, Georges, and thank you, Gordon. Also, I think one of the most interesting things about this conference is, not far into it, I guess, as we are, is how many overlaps there are and how much I think each of the regions can really learn from each other. Part of that, the funding that you referenced in the bill, if I'm reading it correctly, which is, it's only been out for a few hours at this point, seems to be really focused on interregional planning, which would be, I think, a huge help if we could actually, if the federal government wants to step in and facilitate that, that's probably great for all of us. I think that's always been a hard issue, largely because of the question that Gordon got earlier is how do you deal with cost allocation once you start with real interregional planning, and I doubt they have a solution to that, but if they want to put some money toward the study of it, that's great. So let me back up for a second. I am Lathrop Craig. I work with PSEG. I assume most of you know, but just in case anyone doesn't, PSEG is the largest investor-owned utility in New Jersey. We serve about 3/4 of the population there with electric transmission, distribution, and also natural gas distribution. In addition to overseeing our offshore wind development program, I also run our energy trading and natural gas supply businesses. So that Gordon's presentation, really hit me with so many of the kind of problems that we're wrestling with, frankly, in New Jersey and PJM, as we look to build out the system and change the energy supply and the way that energy supply flows into the system. PSEG is a investor currently in the first offshore wind project that will be coming online in New Jersey, hopefully starting in the end of 2024 and fully online in 2025. New Jersey, similar to New York, has relatively aggressive offshore wind specific goals as part of our clean energy transition plan. Our goal is 7,500 megawatts also by 2035, so we are marching very much, I think, in parallel with New York. We've had 2 solicitations so far, awarded projects, awarded OREC orders to 3 projects represents, somewhere I think in the 37 to 3,800 megawatt range. So we're about halfway there, and have several solicitations planned over the next the sort of the remainder of this decade to get all the way there. And we're also interestingly in the middle of what is probably one of the first probably is the first state-run Order 1000 project, which is referred to in PJM as a state agreement approach project. New Jersey, working with PJM, last year opened a solicitation for offshore wind transmission. The basic construct of that solicitation was that we were looking for up to transmission projects that would allow for delivery of up to the remaining amount of offshore wind generation, so sort of the balance, the other half of our offshore wind planned build out in the state. There was huge response to that. I think it was something like 15 different entities submitted 80 bids into PJM. It was the sort of facilitating the process. Those bids are still being evaluated. But I think one of the things that's kind of led to, which I think Gordon spoke to a bit, is some real confusion over what do you do with that many ideas for how to bring various amounts of transmission in, because some people bid lower amounts and I can do a cheaper project for less money. Other people did large projects to try to get the entire remaining balance in. Lots of different ideas on where to interconnect, how much to interconnect there, the technologies to use, and somehow or other PJM and the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities have to now figure out what to do with that. How do I decide what's sort of the best project and the most economical project, which I think kind of leads you back to, it would make a lot of sense to figure out what you want to do first, and then sort of seek out that competitive market to figure out how to actually do it best. And when doing that, I think, again, Gordon mentioned the value of things like a contingency plan in that, and trying to, again, evaluate. I've got one bid that has very, very low contingency, looks like the cost is great. I've got another one maybe with lots of contingency, cost doesn't look as great, but risk is different between those two projects, right? And trying to evaluate that is difficult. In sort of the best of circumstances. So that's what our state is trying to wrestle with at the moment. I think it does call out very strongly for better planning going into this. And I think particularly things like the meshed grid or mesh ready grid concept, is difficult to tease out how that wins in the competitive process if it hasn't been mandated ahead of time, right? The value, that $60 million a year, and we've done similar analysis on our side in PJM, and we think we also think it's worth tens of millions of dollars a year in potential savings to have that optionality built into the system so that power can flow from one interconnection point to another interconnection point in those times when you have outages, planned or unplanned. It's difficult to evaluate. It can be done, but it's tough to sometimes make those distinctions in a bid process where people have all kinds of different designs. So that's that's something that I think is very much. Would be very much valuable in this effort by the various states to build the system out more. And then the other thing I said particularly is, or that I wanted to respond to, maybe as we get into the conversation, is I think that this shift in resource mix from where we are today and where we've been in the past to where we're going does desperately call out for what is that balancing resource, or the energy storage, or whatever you want to call it. Gordon had a great slide on that 17-18 winter and what happened here in New England. I'll tell you, I was in our energy trading group, which manages the sort of day-to-day energy output of our generation fleet. Back in the winter of 17-18, we experienced very similar conditions. To Gordon's point, when it's cold here, it's cold down in New Jersey too, usually, or warm, whichever extreme you want. And back then, it was before we had sold our gas generation plant, so we had our fleet. We had a relatively large fleet of natural gas generators. We didn't have quite the same restrictions on gas that New England does, but I'll tell you, through that week, and for us it was really a 1 week, very difficult and very cold period. We had no physical gas supply to our gas fleet, and the only thing we had to run was oil. Right, so we had that same issue of gas generation gone, oil, we're backing it up with oil. This was before the RPM, or capacity performance market, came into effect in New England. We were the only fossil generators that we could see on the system in New Jersey that were generating through that. We were generating all on oil. We were maxed out with the imports that we had coming from Pennsylvania in the west. We couldn't import any more on those transmission lines in. And when the weather finally turned on whatever that last day was for us, we were 3 hours away from running out of oil in our biggest two generators, which was almost 2,000 megawatts on a system that was probably because our winter peak, it hasn't shifted to that higher winter peak yet. So our winter peak was probably around maybe somewhere between 7 and 10 in the whole state, and we were going to take 2,000 off. We had nothing. There was no more imports to have. There was nothing, and that was how close we were. And no one knew it because nobody else could see kind of the levels in our tanks. So we went around at that time to the state, to PJM, to FERC, and tried to explain that risk that was there in the system at that time. Unfortunately, we haven't seen sort of the market design response that actually solves that problem. I'll tell you, that was because of the expense of preparing those units each year to actually run on oil, which doesn't happen magically. There's sort of preparation you have to do every year to do that. That was the last year that we actually invested in that. And every other year we had oil in the tanks, but the units were not ready to run because we couldn't justify the value of doing it because the market design wasn't creating that opportunity. And that's going to be that problem still exists now, I think. I don't think we have a good solution for that going forward. So figuring out how to, and I'm not advocating for necessarily oil being the backup. That's not really the point. It's how do you recognize that you need that in those extreme situations? What is it going to be? Because I agree it's not likely to be lithium-ion batteries. And how do you compensate it?
Okay, go to Bill.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Quinlan. I'm President of Transmission and Offshore Wind for Eversource. So I'll give you perspective both from a transmission owner sense and also from the offshore wind side of things. So transmission-wise, for those of you who are not familiar with Eversource, we're the largest transmission owner in New England. We serve Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. So 3 of the 6 states that Gordon was referring to. We operate and serve about 50% of New England's loads, all the way from the far northern reaches of New Hampshire along the Canadian border down to New York City, in essence. And we serve the Boston load pocket as well. So we'll start with transmission. And Gordon touched upon this, and by the way, I agree with virtually everything Gordon said. I thought his remarks were excellent. Over the last 2 decades here in New England, we've been building a lot of transmission. We have built a lot of the $13 billion that Gordon was referring to, and it was primarily for 2 purposes. 1, pure reliability, and 2, to eliminate congestion on the system. So, 20 years ago, We had significant congestion around Greater Boston, significant congestion down in southwest Connecticut near the New York border, and by virtue of that transmission investment, congestion in New England is essentially non-existent. And at the time, it was costing New England customers about $600 million a year in above market cost. So that's all gone as a result of the transmission investment. And today we are, continuing to invest in transmission, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the transmission we need to invest in the future is really different, right? It needs to enable clean energy, this transformation that Gordon alluded to. And from my perspective, we don't want to be the impediment to the transition that our states want to achieve. From my view, transmission needs to get out in front of that transition and enable the future. And we see this on the solar side in New England. So there's been a lot of solar built in southeastern Massachusetts, which we happen to serve. And I think it's consistent with what you hear in PJM. The solar developers just want the grid to be able to accept their projects. And there's a lot of discussion about backups in the queue, and the grid's not ready. And we don't want that to happen in New England, particularly around offshore wind. So what does that look like? For New England, we are blessed in some respects with retirements of baseload generation assets that Gordon was referring to, generally along our coastline. We've retired 6 nuclear facilities and virtually all of our coal and oil along the coastline, and these represent really great interconnection points for offshore wind. So from our regulated transmission business, we are working to use those interconnection points to enable offshore wind. So probably the single best example of this is Cape Cod. So Cape Cod is it's a primary interconnection point for offshore wind in New England. And I'll just say, New England as a region is targeting anywhere from 10 to 15 gigawatts of offshore wind. And a lot of that is already under development. So the first projects are coming onshore in our service territory on Cape Cod. And why is that a great interconnection point? It happens to be a decent place from the transmission grid perspective. It's fairly robust. It's also relatively close to the lease areas that were released by the federal government. Those lease areas have probably the best wind profiles of any in the country, relatively shallow water depth. So many of the first offshore wind projects in this country, similar to the Block Island wind farm you're going to visit later today, are off the coast of Montauk and Cape Cod, and the interconnection point is our system in Cape Cod. And how are we approaching that from a transmission owner perspective? We've developed a concept called co-optimization, where we are trying to integrate interconnection needs with reliability upgrades that are needed on the system. So that part of the system was already slated for transmission upgrades. We have not just focused on those reliability needs, but now we've said, okay, we need to enable, in this instance, 2,800 megawatts of wind to interconnect. And how do we do that in a co-optimized fashion where we build the infrastructure sufficient to meet all the needs, and then we allocate costs accordingly. So portion goes to regional network customers, portion goes to local network customers, these are transmission customers, and then the incremental costs go to the wind developers. In this case, Vineyard Wind, who's building the first offshore wind farm, large scale in this country. We recently had success at the FERC. We negotiated those support agreements with Vineyard Wind. We filed them at the FERC. FERC approved these agreements, including the cost allocation. And they're kind of first of a kind in this country we're trying to get to this issue of how do you allocate costs and share costs and meet multiple needs with one set of investments. So we're really excited about that. And we think it's a model for, I'll say, the transmission owner working with the states, working with the offshore wind developers to make this a reality. On the competitive side, I'm also president of our transmission, of our offshore wind business. So Eversource was we are partnered with Ørsted. Ørsted is a Danish corporation. They're the largest offshore wind developer in the world. We have a 50-50 joint venture with Ørsted that's exclusive. So any of the projects being built in New England or New York are being co-developed by Ørsted and Eversource. We have 3 projects that are currently under development. The first one, and they're all interesting from a transmission perspective. The first one is referred to as South Fork Wind. It's in active construction. We broke ground on the transmission, the onshore transmission, in February of this year. My team's developing all the onshore transmission for all 3 projects. Interestingly, we are coming onshore in the Hamptons. So who's familiar with the Hamptons here? Hampton, all right? So we picked a great location to come onshore. But, and this is, I think, to Gordon's point, which is you have to lay the foundation locally and with the states before you could pick a place like the Hamptons to build transmission infrastructure. So we spent years working with local entities, with the state of New York, in I'll say laying the foundation for that work to take place. And I'm excited, the transmission build-out's going wonderfully. It's on schedule. That project will go in service, both the wind project next year, 2023. It'll be the next large offshore wind project to go in service in the region. First one tying into the New York grid. We think it'll be a model for the industry, and we were excited about the way the transmission is going there. Our second project, ironically, is interconnecting here in Rhode Island. It's referred to as Revolution Wind. It's a 704 megawatt facility. It's tying into the PP&L, or Rhode Island Energy substation in Davisville. So we're working very closely with that transmission owner on the interconnection of Revolution Wind. We expect to break ground on that project next year and put it in service in 2025. And then our third project is our largest. It's 924 megawatts. It's under contract to NYSERDA. It's called Sunrise Wind. It's being built 35 miles east of Montauk, so just south of this Rhode Island coastline. It's a very large project, relatively far distance from the interconnection in Holbrook. So we have 90 miles of underwater transmission that needs to be built. This will be the first use of HVDC technology for offshore wind, certainly in this country, and for Ørsted, who's the largest developer in the world, their first ever use of HVDC. So we're bringing HVDC expertise to the table in this case. I think, as these wind farms are further and further off the coastline, increasingly we're going to be using HVDC to bring it onshore, and so we're excited about that. That's deep. That project is very far along in its siting and permitting cycle. It'll be approved hopefully this time next year, and then we'll break ground. So, I think this offshore wind industry is it is becoming a reality. I can attest to that. As I say, we are already in construction, and I think in short order we're going to have 3 projects in active construction. And when we look at New England, and Gordon showed the future generation mix, it's going to be very heavily dependent on offshore wind. And I think from a transmission owner perspective, our goal is to figure out how to achieve that transition. What are the right interconnection points? How do we build out the grid around those interconnection points so that we can accept that generation? Because I think it's coming. I think you're going to see 20, 30 gigawatts of offshore wind on the eastern seaboard in relatively short order, and I think the grid is the enabler of all of that. So as a company, that's our goal, is to facilitate the transition. I agree with the comments made earlier about interregional transmission. I think that is going to be the balancing resource in New England. I think for a variety of reasons, this region is moving away from fossil fuels. And I see it on the interstate pipeline side of things. We tried to build a relatively large interstate gas pipeline into New England a few years ago, referred to as Access Northeast. We wanted to build additional LNG storage facilities, and the region just wasn't willing to accept it. We even see it today with LDC, reliability-based gas infrastructure projects. They're getting shot down across New England. So I don't think a future in New England based on fossil fuels is consistent with the public policy. I think there is a very strong anti-gas sentiment in this region that we just have to work our way through, because I don't think it's going to be a significant part. But the exciting thing for transmission owners and wind developers is I think that is a big part of the future, and I look forward to the questions.
Very well. Thank you all for those summaries of what you're working on. Super interesting stuff across the Northeast. I'm not a technical expert, so I'm a little hesitant to broach this subject, but I'm going to try, because I'm really interested in the concept that the transmission needed for offshore wind is different in many ways than the transmission that's been traditionally built out here. So maybe Lathrop first, and then Bill, could you talk a little bit about your experience with what those differences are and how they change the way you have to operate?
Sure. Thanks, Sam. I think it's a great question. Just internally in PSEG, we talk about how the system is transitioning from a rivers to ocean to rivers, with the idea being that in the past, the generation that we use has generally been sited along rivers, largely in the western part of PJM, and the power has flown from there, from what were old large coal plants, and now it's lots of gas plants, sitting on top of the Marcellus Shale, toward the load centers in the east, which are closer to the shore. What we're doing now, we're starting to do now and having to plan for, is putting very large amounts of offshore wind generation. So lots of energy will be flowing from the ocean into the system, along the shoreline, basically. And at least in certain times, because the sort of load factor of the capacity factor of those units throughout time, through the year, through days, hours in the day, is not perfectly correlated with the load on shore, unfortunately. There are going to be times when that power has to start flowing from east to west, unless and until we get economic and sort of sensible bulk storage that goes along with it, which we're starting to look at opportunities to do that, but it's that doesn't help the economics of projects for the most part right now. So you're taking a system that was in PJM world was really built to flow west to east, and we're now going to be pushing it east to west. And it doesn't, the system isn't just sort of designed perfectly to go from one to the other. And within that, there will be lots of other power flows that are just sort of different than they were before. And to get a sense of why this is a bigger problem now, I always like to sort of tell people, look, we have in New Jersey, where we've been a very big supporter of the solar build out, have spent over a decade supporting and bringing online pretty material amounts of solar. We have thousands of megawatts of solar, a lot of it behind the meter, but some of it in utility scale, grid interconnected. But if you look at what that produces in the way of energy, we're still under 5% of our load is coming from those sort of existing renewable resources, and I'm pretty sure a lot of that isn't even really in-state solar. It's some of the out-of-state wind that we're getting. So, unfortunately, although this kind of goes back to Gordon's great slides too. If you think about the energy transition to this point, though we've been trying very hard to add renewables, he had a slide in New England that showed, it's only maybe 4% shift in the renewable, contribution over whatever that time period was, which mostly just offset the loss of nuclear, right? So we haven't really seen the effect of what's going to happen when we shift to lots and lots of energy actually coming from renewable resources. Again, back to New Jersey, we similarly, like I said, we only have about 5% of our energy coming from solar right now. When we bring on the first offshore wind project into New Jersey, just the first one, that's going to be, I think, close to 7% of our load. And when we bring all of that, the generation on from all 7,500 megawatts, that's going to be about 40% of the load of New Jersey that we're going to be bringing on. And again, not perfectly correlated with the actual load in New Jersey. So there are going to be much, much bigger impacts on the power flows in the system than we've experienced to date. And it's going to have major impacts on what we need in the way of an onshore transmission system in order to manage that.
Yeah. New England's a little different in this regard. The New England grid was built based on central generating facilities, as Gordon mentioned, along the shoreline, relatively close to the load pockets. And even our nuclear plants were built very close to the load pockets. So you retire all that generation, and now you replace it with offshore wind, which is not close to the load pockets. It might be 50 or 80 or 100 miles offshore. So now, instead of relatively short transmission lines into the load pockets, now you're talking about bringing substantial quantities of energy from offshore, onshore. So that leads to the use of the HVDC technology, that I alluded to. So I think that's a big difference. This country doesn't have a lot of experience with HVDC technology. I mean, we use it in some of our ties to Canada because for the same reason, it's long distance transmission, but I think you're going to see a very significant increase in the use of that technology in this region. The other obvious difference is you're building offshore, right? So we're building substations offshore. The first offshore US substation we are building right now, a company in Texas called Kiewit is constructing it. So now we're building large electric infrastructure in a marine environment, which is, it's different. It's never been done in the United States before. And so I think from a transmission perspective, it's a very different world. And even the onshore, the second big difference is the onshore approach. Most of our system is overhead. Transmission is overhead in New England, other than in downtown Boston or in certain areas of Southwest Connecticut. But to overcome some of the siting and permitting challenges that Gordon mentioned, most of our onshore transmission will be underground. So I mentioned the Hamptons. You're not building overhead transmission lines through the Hamptons, right? So I think use of underground construction methods and transmission is going to be far more prevalent for offshore wind than it is in our transmission. Those are the two big differences for us, distance and means and methods.
So turning back to New York, which of course obviously has its own unique geography, can you sort of talk about you mentioned the cable routing plan that's been under development. Can you talk about the factors that went into that and sort of give us some more detail there?
Absolutely. So what we've been doing is really adopting a collaborative process and including the different stakeholders as we figure out the optimal cable routes and points of interconnection for New York. So we've been coordinating with different state agencies, with different utilities, and different stakeholders, whether it's the maritime industry, whether it's the fisheries industry, understanding what different maritime infrastructure and utility infrastructure are already in place in these different pathways. And so what we've been doing is collecting all this information, and in August we're going to be releasing through an RFI the results of the study so that we have full transparency in the industry and put it in the context of our live offshore wind solicitations so that developers have access to the latest information and can put proposals together that take all of this information into consideration. Now, the outcome of this exercise is really just to understand what are the different options for points of interconnection and cable routes, but also understand like what are the limitations, what are some mitigation strategies we need to put in place, and our goal is not to say no, don't go with that route. Our goal is to direct and say, how can you adapt, or where should you go instead? So we're very eager to put, to finalize this analysis and share it with all the different stakeholders so that we can really, at the core of it, go back to our state goals and help inform how do we achieve these goals in an environmentally responsible way and a cost-effective way. I just also want to mention one other activity that we're doing. We're starting to think about going deeper into the New York Bight, and we're kicking off by the end of the year what we call the Master Plan 2.0 for offshore wind for New York. That really looks at deeper waters. Is going to be, and obviously transmission planning is going to be part of that exercise. As you go deeper, there's going to be, longer distance transmission is going to be a even more critical issue to consider in our planning.
So. We're actually seeing this in New England. So, one of the areas that the federal government is looking at for New England for potential lease areas is the Gulf of Maine, which again, optimal wind profiles, right? Very consistent wind speeds. The issue is water depth, and you get beyond a certain water depth, and fixed bed foundations where the wind farms are actually anchored into ocean floor is not practical. So, it gets you into a different technology where the wind turbines are actually floating, and that's something that's being deployed in Europe now. They're just starting the first few projects. I think you're going to see that in New England. And I'll just comment on the New York issue. New York is very similar to Cape Cod in some respects. Obviously the first several projects, including ours, target Long Island because it's the shortest distance, and the grid could accept a certain amount of injection. But now you're at the point where Long Island is starting. There's not that much load on Long Island, just like there is not in Cape Cod. So the next challenge is how do you get power into, in New York's instance, into New York City. In our instance with Gordon, how do we get offshore wind from the Cape to Boston, or the Cape across Rhode Island into the Connecticut load pockets? I think that's where the transmission grid can enable. I think the same is absolutely true in New York. You need to move beyond Long Island.
And I think there are two great points here. One is this. Bill brought up the focus on HVDC as a technology, and I think that sort of plays into the challenge of the routing from shore to land. One of the several advantages of HVDC is just the transfer capability of the cables. So you get more transfer capability per cable coming ashore, which means you don't have as many cables that you need to bring ashore. And when we look at where we're trying to bring power ashore in these kind of New Jersey, New York, and probably even New England area, although I'm less familiar with that, these are congested areas, right? There's a fair amount of shoreline between New Jersey and Long Island, but there's a lot going on in that area. You've got massive, shipping going in and out of the channels. You have fishing, commercial fishing, recreational fishing going on, and there are a lot of cables already on the seafloor, right? So we focus a lot on the routing on land because that's where the people are, and that's where most of the sort of public focus has been. But it's a congested geography already on the seafloor to get there. And in my life before I was a energy developer, I was in the Navy. I went to Officer Candidate School here in Newport when it was here, so it's kind of fun to be back. And I remember very well the October and November winds. Actually, it was more like November and December winds here in Newport because we spent most of our time outside back then. But when I was in the Navy, we used to have a little bit of a joke of how do you avoid collisions with other vessels. I was a submariner, so making sure you don't hit things that you can't see was kind of a big deal. And the joke was when you were losing all the information that we usually use to try to track other vessels, say, okay, well, we're just going to go back to hopefully it's the big ocean theory. So the big ocean theory was it's a big ocean. Statistically, you're probably not going to be in the same place at the same time. That's not really a great plan, right? That wasn't the real way that we tried to avoid collisions. It was that sort of a jokey fallback of what do you do when when your plan isn't working? Well, this is the same sort of thing. It feels like it's a big ocean, but it really isn't. Getting to shore, getting to the critical points on shore is difficult. There's not a lot of great real estate to do that. And that leads you to, I think, both use of a better technology, HVDC, and planning. To get this done, given the volumes of offshore wind that the three of us want to create, you've got to have planning.
We'll turn to some audience questions. We should have time for a couple.
Yeah, I have two. I'll just throw them out. I was interested how you think about hurricanes. So the European experience, they don't have hurricanes. Climate change is likely to produce more hurricanes. So I look at that and say, that looks like a correlated contingency to me. But I'm interested to hear your views on that. And the second thing, listening to the conversation around HVDC cables, is supply chains. So can the manufacturers that make this stuff keep up with you? Or is that going to become the bottleneck?
Yeah. On the hurricane front, obviously, we frame it around resiliency, and in a very practical way, right? We have a live solicitation right now. A key requirement that we've asked for in any proposal from developers is for them to share with us their resiliency plans and the redundancies they build in, and all the technical details for their proposals to address these issues specifically. So that is a hard requirement that we include. Now, there's been a lot of thinking about how do we take that to the next level, and by discussing this with the private sector, insurance companies, investors, because that all goes into their math and their risk assessment on whether they would want to back and finance these projects. The result of these conversations has come back that nobody is really going to go above and beyond unless the government mandates and sets standards around us. So I think, at least personally, where my mind is at is if we were to evolve and increase the resiliency even further, that we need to get our heads together to figure out how do we set some of these mandates, these resiliency mandates.
And maybe from the supply chain perspective, I think that's a huge issue, not just for the offshore wind industry, but I'll just say this entire transmission build out. We're certainly seeing challenges on virtually every aspect of it, whether it's transformers, breakers, structures, wire, cable. There's pressure on price, and there's pressure on lead times, meaning they're pushing out. The interesting thing, in my view, it's exacerbated when you're talking about offshore wind, because for transmission, a lot of that's domestically produced. When you're talking about offshore wind, there's not a supply chain for wind turbines in the United States or many of the other technology foundations in the United States. Everything is being fabricated in Europe or Asia and being shipped to the United States currently. And if you look at what's going on globally from a stability perspective, there are some real issues there. I mean, one of our projects, Siemens is building the HVDC system for Sunrise, and the protection and controls engineering is being done in the Ukraine, and the steel's coming from Romania. And if you think about what's going on in those parts of the world, it presents some real challenges. So I think that's an issue for the offshore wind industry in this country. You know, the good news is we're starting to, as the number of projects increases, we're starting to build some of the foundational supply chain in this country. So, you know, we partnered with Nexans on cable manufacturer down in Charleston, South Carolina, and we're partnered with Dominion on constructing the first Jones Act vessel. There's not a ship today in the United States that can install one of these wind turbines. So we're building a vessel. We're the first charter of Dominion's Charybdis, which is being built down in Texas. I mentioned the substation we're building in Texas. You know, we're building a foundation manufacturing facility up in the Port of Coymans, New York. So the elements of a supply chain are starting to be developed in this country, which is kind of exciting. It's one of the benefits of the entire build out. It's going to create jobs and economic activity for the United States, but it's going to take some time. You know, today, the vast majority of that equipment's coming from overseas, and I think the supply chain issues are significant.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Certainly from the New Jersey offshore wind project, we're seeing the same kind of pressures on the supply chain. You know, I think there's a real risk that we don't get where we're going as fast as we would like to because of that. You know, what impact that has on where we get at the end, whether we sort of lose any of the back end projects, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, but I think it is a real risk, and it's something that certainly we're looking at carefully as we consider the investments going forward. I would agree that the supply chain and the attempts to move more of that to domestic supply is going to be very, very important to the overall success of this industry, offshore wind industry in the United States. We are also constructing a turbine manufacturing facility in Paulsboro as part of the Ocean Wind 1 project. That facility is fairly far along. I've heard that they're actually going to start the first test welding there within the next couple of weeks. The GE is supplying the turbines for our investment in Ocean Wind 1. They're transitioning a blade manufacturing plant up in Canada from onshore blades to offshore blades. So we're starting to see pieces of it, but there's absolutely a long way to go to get that supply chain more assured. The other thing I just wanted to react to from yours, you talked about correlated risk. I'm not sure exactly what you were getting at there. I mean, interestingly to me, one of the correlations, of course, is that if you have a particularly bad storm and it takes out some portion of the offshore wind farm, historically, it would probably also take out a fair amount of your load on shore, because it's going to hit and it's going to knock down the overhead lines that exist, maybe not in the Hamptons, but everywhere else. And you're going to lose a fair amount of load at the same time. I don't know if this is the correlation you were talking about or not, but I can also tell you we have spent a lot of time, because that was one of the first things that our board of directors brought up and wanted us to really look at is what is the risk of hurricane damage. We're moving into new turbine designs that nobody's tried before. These 10, 12, more megawatt turbines will be first of the kind as they go in. So I don't think nobody really knows what's going to happen with those. But if you look at the design basis for them, and you look at the experience that's been had in Europe, which isn't hurricane level, but there are some pretty strong winds in the North Sea. It would tell you that the design basis is very adequate for the kinds of winds that we're going to see. At least my experience is more New Jersey based in the wind profile that we see there than New England. But the reality is most of the storms that get up here aren't hitting as force Category 5 hurricanes. I think the history is, it's been a while since we did this, that we've never actually had one of those. They start as Category 5 down in the Gulf area, but by the time they get up here, they're not. And a lot of the damage that we have is more kind of water, the rain, and the tidal effects that come with that. More so than the strength of the wind. Now, who knows what's going to happen with global warming? I don't know, but it would tell you it's probably going to get worse. But based on the history and some projection of what could happen, the design's basis seems adequate. And to the point that George just raised, while there's not a requirement certainly for the developers to meet those, I can tell you there's a lot of incentive for it. Because those plants are only recovering their invested capital if they run, and particularly if they run in that first, say, 10 years or so of the OREC contracts where we are. Again, it might be a little different structure where they are, but there's a lot of incentive to keep those plants running.
Stu, before you ask your question, I just want to say one sentence real quick on supply chain. I'm burning to say it. Building the supply chain for offshore wind is critical for us in New York. We already, the states co-invested with the private sector $200 million in the past. And in our current solicitation, we have $500 million of state money that's going to be hopefully incentivizing and attracting cable manufacturers related to transmission, blades, nacelles, tier 2 and tier 3 manufacturers. So this is a big priority for us, and we're eager to see how it unfolds in our upcoming solicitation.
One more question. We'll have to do lightning round answers because we're just about at time.
Well, I know we're at time, but we didn't really focus that much on transmission, the transmission group. So I was just curious, right? The early offshore wind projects seem to have their radial lines, and New York, sort of indicated yesterday they're mesh ready. New Jersey is looking at, sort of building out corridors robustly for growth, right, which you don't get if you do radial transmission interconnections per offshore wind site. So what are thoughts maybe of folks on the panel about how do we grow the transmission so that the grid is actually an offshore grid, an extension of the onshore grid, maybe with being built out robustly, interconnected, providing more resiliency, and maybe even helping customers because it gets recovered over a longer period of time, so the annual costs are cheaper. Just thoughts on how we get from where we are starting to where ultimately we need to be with an offshore grid.
I mean, I think the answer goes back to planning at some level, whether that's at the ISO or the state level. The incentive isn't really there on a project-by-project basis to do it. So if you leave the planning such as it is to be a project-by-project solicitation, you're not going to get there. So I think New York's approach makes a lot of sense, where they've kind of standardized a design that they want to have the developers build to, and which includes the technology for the AC meshed grid kind of behind each of those radial lines. In New Jersey and PJM now, with this state agreement approach process that New Jersey's initiated, again, the only way we're going to get there is if the state decides that that's what they want, right? And the challenge is, because they didn't go into that solicitation with that mandate, it was much more, it's kind of bring us your ideas. They don't have in front of them many options to create that real mesh grid. They have a number of options that include a DC interconnect, which is not as robust as the AC, because the design is that it's typically not connected, and you just sort of have the ability to connect it in a emergency situation. So that, again, it goes back to, it's really important to think about the design that you want ahead of time, and then somehow or other come up with a process that requires you actually use that design. And that design should, to get maximum benefit, include a normally closed, sort of energized circuit, so that you can flow power continuously back and forth between the various interconnects that you have.
And I'll just say, from a New England perspective, until we've exhausted our obvious interconnection points that exist on today's system, that capital is better invested onshore in building redundancy and resiliency. You know, the one state that looked at the prospect of an offshore transmission network was Massachusetts. They did a fairly comprehensive review of the wisdom of that for New England, and they concluded it doesn't really make sense currently. You know, it was going to be cost prohibitive. You run into the issue of what happens if you construct it and the projects don't show up for whatever reason, then customers are exposed. And the wind developers, who, you know, were pretty consistent on this, didn't believe it was necessary for New England at that time. So I think for New England, what you're going to see is the first, however many, let's say 10 gigawatts of wind could be developed, just focused on the existing onshore transmission system with lead lines, build the resilience and redundancy onshore, get it to the load centers, which is where the capital is better invested. And then in the future, you know, look at the potential need for an offshore grid. The New York approach, which is like the mesh-ready approach, is a great concept, you know, because then you can construct it if and when it makes economic and other sense to do so. We're just not there yet in New England.
I'll just say two things. Number one, on the onshore side, New York State, you know, published a power grid study a year or two ago that basically the outcome of the study and then the synthesis of the study says that we don't need any major bulk transmission upgrades in New York or on Long Island. Basically, we can accommodate 3 gigawatts of offshore wind to interconnect to Long Island and 6 gigawatts into New York City. So that covers our 9 gigawatt goal for now, but then beyond that, significant transmission upgrades would be needed. Number two, you know, I agree, obviously we need to evolve our planning, and these are early days. On my mind, we've set the stage for the mesh-ready concept from a technical perspective. And so like we've discussed, I think on my mind what's next is how do we enable, go beyond the technical and enable, you know, the business models and the commercial models to build a meshed grid, and how do we operate that meshed grid? These are some of the next questions on my mind on that we need to evolve and figure out.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of you. It was a great panel. I learned a ton.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,